Buenas tardes, good afternoon. I'm really delighted that you are all here on a sunny afternoon after having had several days of rain. I kid you not, this afternoon I think you are going to have a real treat as you listen to the author of Power at the Roots, Gentrification, Community Gardens, and the Puerto Ricans of the Lower East Side. I am Arlene Torres, the director of the Latino Faculty Initiative at CUNY, and I work to recruit Latino faculty system-wide. On occasion, I get the chance to review some of the work of my colleagues and to present some of the wonderful activities that the Center for Puerto Rican Studies is engaged in. I want to make you aware that the Puerto Rican Day Parade is on Friday, June 8th from 12 to 2. There is a Centro's 100 Puerto Ricans campaign that will honor present and past presidents. And in addition, there is an exhibit highlighting Luis Rascam's photography picturing Puerto Rico under the American flag, and that is located at the Centro Library and Archives at the Silverman School of Social Work on 3rd Avenue and 119th Street. And I had the privilege of seeing that exhibit when it opened last week, and it's really breathtaking, so I would encourage you to attend. Additionally, there are brochures, 100 Puerto Ricans. We're looking for 100 Puerto Ricans who have made a difference. I can name millions, and so I want to encourage you to take a look at the brochure and to encourage some of the members of our community to participate and to have their papers and their stories become part of our archive. Now, let me turn to Miranda's work. Miranda is soon to be, and I can make an unofficial announcement, associate professor at Brooklyn College. She was just promoted and received tenure. And she is a sociologist by training, but for this evening I'm going to claim her as one of my own, as an anthropologist who does beautiful ethnography. Oftentimes we buy books because when we're in a bookstore, we look at the jacket, we look at the spine, and it looks interesting to us. And sometimes the title is compelling. At other times we have to read it because it's part of the research that we're engaged in, or it's something that we've been assigned in a class. I was particularly drawn to the title, Power at the Roots, and I really didn't read the subtitle. But because I was so attracted to the title, I decided that it was a book that I was going to peruse. And when I started to peruse the piece, I became enamored with it. Why? Over 30 years ago, I became interested in studying credit associations at the University of West Indies in Barbados. And while I was there, I was introduced to elderly women in rural communities who had kitchen gardens. And they used those kitchen gardens not only for their subsistence, but also for livelihood, because the goods that they produced from those kitchen gardens, they sold at the market in Bridgetown. And what I did as a field worker was to develop a relationship with the women who worked in the markets, and I learned a great deal about the process of marketing those goods. But in order for me to really understand that, since I was a city girl, I had to learn something about kitchen gardens. Now, I kid you not, I knew nothing about kitchen gardens. And they taught me a great deal about how to plant, about monocropping, about intercropping, about how you take particular kinds of legumes and you plant them so that they fix nitrate in the soil and so that they can regenerate the soil for future planting. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because of my own personal past, I was particularly interested in power at the roots and the gardens. And what I came to find out was that Miranda expanded for me my thinking and experience with kitchen gardens by asking me to critically think about the relationship between kitchen gardens and processes of gentrification in the Lower East Side. So I thank you for that. She states that the purpose of the book is, and I quote, to understand gardeners as both active, creative, political campaigners, and as local people overwhelmed by economic interests that are largely beyond their reach. The essential truth is that the local movements can and do influence the governance and spatial forms of global cities. But the powerful economic and political force that drive gentrification shape the political context in which movements must make their claims. End quote. Now, throughout the work, two concepts continue to resonate. The first was a moral topography, and the second, taming, or to be tamed. She opens with a vignette where a motley crew celebrates the rites of spring. This frames the book as it provides us with an ethnographic particularity that challenges the broad strokes in the literature on gentrification. She notes, and again I quote, their experiences as residents and activists on the Lower East Side gave them experience in resistive praxis whose character informs the symbolism of the rites of spring, end quote. Demonstrations, she notes, have an air of pageantry, and at the same time, they are deeply pragmatic. Now, the question was, how do community gardens help us understand local movements of resistance and processes of gentrification? Celebrations, as well as daily enactments in the garden and in the broader community, embody an ethic of interdependence and hospitality. They're culturally specific practices and motifs embodied in the gardens, and among them, a Puerto Rican aesthetic and sensibility. But before we get into the gardens, Martinez situates them and the people who care for them within a broader context. She considers, first, the global city. She focuses on growing inequality, the occupational division that informs spatial and residential segregation, the changing forms of governance to police the city in order to promote private investment and deny the poor and the working poor access to social services, and processes of gentrification following September 11. She then situates the Lower East Side community historically and as such maps out the overlapping diasporas of Jewish, Chinese, and Puerto Rican residents vis-a-vis the newcomers of the late 20th and 21st century. She notes, the Lower East Side was from the 1950s to the 1970s recognized as an important Puerto Rican artistic cultural center. All the while, she is attendant to the mobilization of community members in local politics to offset plans for urban renewal. The demise of affordable housing and gardens for Puerto Ricans, among others living in the neighborhood, in short, was not achieved without a fight, and she documents this beautifully. She astutely observes adaptability and creativity sustain local resistance and make possible the renewal of local praxis. As such, she stresses that researchers fail to deal with processes of gentrification at the local level and tend to portray communities as socially polarized, us and them. This portrayal, although sympathetic to the struggles of those being displaced, she notes, is problematic in that it seems to give short shrift to the creative capacity of local people, and it exaggerates the unity and the fixity of neighborhood life in urban settings. The gardens, then, are a window to the possibilities and to the limitations of and enactments of community in the Lower East Side. Now, I'll let Miranda tell you a little bit more about the gardens in particular. I so appreciated her discussion of the range of community gardens and of the varied styles and cultural meanings attached to the garden, and the method of planting, the measures taken to ensure community access and ownership. There is a moral topography to gardening in urban locales that is informed by structural inequality, class, gender, and the struggle at multiple levels over space. And this was most poignantly expressed in the vignette over the Tupperware Tower. Now, permit me to explain a little bit about the Tupperware Tower in her own words. And I quote, "One day I was at one of my garden sites with a collection of gardeners, and a well-known member arrived, Mario, whom everyone greeted with joy and relief. Mario, a favorite in the garden, had been seriously ill to such a degree that he hardly entered the garden all summer. Mario was a gay man in his late 30s, and some of his anxiety about his health among garden people who were less close to him had to do with an unconfirmed fear that he might be suffering from AIDS. When Mario appeared thin and walking slowly, but seeming otherwise healthy, everyone seated at the picnic table got up to make him comfortable and fuss over him. As he shook off well-wishers, he placed on the table 2 paper shopping bags filled with Tupperware and turned to 2 Puerto Rican women, Juana and Carmen, telling them that he was returning their containers because he had to get them out of his kitchen. As the 2 women sorted the containers between them, Mario explained to the other onlookers that during his illness, Juana and Carmen had come by almost daily with hearty servings of Puerto Rican home cooking. We all looked at the jumble of containers, and I thought to myself that if Mario was fighting off weight loss and weakness due to HIV, the food in those containers may have saved his life." She goes on to discuss then how the onlookers and other members of the community garden reacted to that Tupperware tower. And I'll leave you to read it so you get the rest of the story. She also discusses taming, metaphorically, culturally, and sociopolitically. And rather than go into detail, I'm going to leave you with some ideas. She talks about taming the landscape, taming the weeds, la maleza, taming the political interlocutors, taming the political subject, taming Puerto Ricans via processes of colonization, displacement, gentrification, and the very academy, taming Anglo invaders, taming and co-opting Latinidad, taming resistance and reconstituting agency in the moral topography of the Lower East Side and the city. And I'll end with another juicy quote of hers. On the Lower East Side, the participation of Puerto Ricans as a recognized constituency is mediated by the acute feelings of dispossession and marginalization that I have described. Bridging politics needs to be about voicing that dispossession and putting it into the context of a social justice politics encompassing a new imagination for the Lower East Side. She goes on to say, the Lower East Side's future identity as a working class, artistic, and Latino neighborhood hinges on the issue of housing availability and affordability created to allow people to stay in place and to enjoy the right to home, and I would add, to their garden. Thank you.
Bien. Can I just ask, just get a sense of where we come from? How many of you would argue you represent the Hunter College community? Very much, all right. How about outside of Hunter, the greater CUNY community? All right, we got a few folks here. How about neither? You would consider yourself all of the above, maybe, or? All right. Okay. Well, nice. Okay. All right, students. Fantastic. Nice to see you here. My name is Alan Aha, and just give you a little bit about my background. I'm very honored to be here with Dr. Martinez and Dr. Torres. I was born to Cuban parents in Miami, where in Little Havana, Miami, where the urban gardens, if you will, are in people's backyards. There's a couple of collective community gardens, but it's not the same. Very much not the same. And then when I was young, we moved to Louisville, Kentucky, which was much more spread out spatially, and the concept of community gardens was very much, in my view, non-existent. There are some, I shouldn't say that, but comparatively speaking, it was a whole different ballgame. But after that, when I went on to graduate school, went to University Graduate School, I decided to focus first on sustainable development, and I have a master's degree in sustainable development, and I actually went abroad to the land of my parents' roots, to Cuba. And I studied many sort of different initiatives there. So I'm giving you this background to let you know that I actually have a vested interest in what Miranda and what Professor Martinez has written in this book. I studied urban gardens there, and I also what you would call community-supported agricultural models as well, which have a different name and sort of a different way of being implemented in La Habana, Cuba especially, and so forth. But let me just say this. And when I moved on from there, and I went to the New School for a doctorate in urban policy. When I was asked to come on board at Brooklyn College in the Puerto Rican Latino Studies department, I was very, very honored. And they asked me a couple years into my time there. I've been there almost 4 years tenure, as an assistant professor, and I was an adjunct there a few more years while I was doing my graduate work. And please forgive me, I have a 4-year-old who was up last night with a stomach bug, and I'm operating on espresso. So please forgive me here. So they asked me to teach a course in the Macaulay Honors College, and the course is called Shaping the Future of New York City. And in that course, a couple of the required core books are your classic The Power Broker by Robert Caro. Has anybody read all 2,000 pages? Yeah, okay. And then there's another one by Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American City. Okay, I see some heads shaking. Okay. All right. Well, as a good Latino studies scholar, I said to myself, fantastic books, critical thinking, awesome. They sort of help us reshape and rethink the way we have sort of, in my view, misplanned New York City. But Latinos are missing, very much so. And how could I complement those two books as required, not necessarily required, but are expected of me, with a fantastic sort of, I would argue, not even alternative, but in fact, a fantastic view of the very praxis is the term that was used, sort of how we negotiate our experiences, our struggles, and how we interpret those political realities in the present. And what was, I found it quite relevant to assign this. So and the reason why I assigned this is because at Brooklyn College there was a struggle going on at the same time. They were building this brand new fancy building, sort of right across anybody ever been out to Midwood and Flatbush, Brooklyn College? All right, they're building this, there's a brand new building, it's been built, it's already there. But in order to build a building, oftentimes they build building, they like to accommodate cars, parking lots. And guess where that parking lot was going to go? Community garden. Yes, exactly, community garden. And make a long story short, there was a series of protests, demonstrations, and the summary is that the community garden was cut in half. And some of it was still there, some of it was moved to the other side. Now, you don't need to be a botanist or a horticulturalist to understand that once you cut a community garden in half, you destroy the roots, you destroy its life. And that led to that it's sort of, it's still struggling, it's still alive, there's still people involved. But I thought, what is a good way to marry on a larger scale what happened at Brooklyn College is what has happened in an entire neighborhood. So I assigned Miranda's book, and what I want to talk a little bit about is sort of what happened and how I applied it in terms of pedagogy. All right, I'll stay away from more of the theoretical and the scholarly. It's integrated in what I'm about to say. So what I did is, after assigning it, I had my students read it, and I said, all right, instead of going chapter by chapter, here's what we're going to do. We're going to break up into 4 groups, and I'm testing to see if you've read. And these 4 groups, and you're going to be uncomfortable with these 4 groups. Some of you are going to be developers. You have come in and you have decided, you have money, you've worked for a development corporation, and you want to build condos. Another group of you are going to be politicians, right? And those politicians can be local to the state level, to as far as how you want to go. I want you to imagine. Based on what you learned, how can you apply it? And then I said, and then there are gardeners. Now I want to see if you've read. How do you describe your gardeners? How many of you in your group will identify as Puerto Rican versus gardeners who have recently moved to the neighborhood 10, 15 years ago, as Professor Martinez highlights in her book? And then are the newcomers, the gentrifiers. Some students said, are we the hipsters? Are we the artists? Or are we the upper middle class or upper class yuppies? Who are we? I said, aha, you read her book. She broke it down. And let me just talk just a little bit about my observations of what I noticed in my class when we assigned it. And for students in the house and graduate students, and if you want, and also professors and teachers, if you want to know how you can use this different ways, it was very interesting to see how people responded. The students who took on the role of the gardeners immediately talked about how they talked a great deal about how gardeners didn't necessarily see eye to eye, and they tried to break down the stereotype. There was this often stereotype that there's hardcore people who only care and only care about sort of the state of the garden. And in Professor Martinez's book, there's a character, I can't remember his name, what's his name? Barry, who unilaterally makes decisions for the rest of the group. And so one of my students said, I'll be Barry. And then there were others saying, but wait a minute, that's undemocratic. And I was glad that they were able to sort of break that down and say, okay, the internal dynamics, the conflict, we got to talk about it. And then there were developers. And the developers sort of had more of a unilateral, sort of a one-eyed vision. That was, build those damn condos. I mean, and they were all in agreement as to why they should build it. And then there were the politicians, and some wanted to take on the role of the governor. Others wanted to be Margarita Lopez. So it was fantastic to sort of see that and play out. While the gentrifiers had their own, or I would say the newcomers had their own discussion. How is it that, as Professor Martinez uses in her book, how is it that they can be bridgers to resolve conflicts so that the community sort of maintains and sustains and democratically empowers each other in ways that both balances the reasons why people move there and also sustains the life, the vitality that made it what it is today in the first place. And to watch that dynamic, to make a long story short, there really wasn't much of a resolution. And the class decided that the developers would not win, that the power should belong to the people. But I asked the class, what people? Who are you talking about? Are you talking about the newcomers? Are you talking about those who have been here quite a long time and who helped create the gardens, make them what they are? And there was a great deal of disagreement as to what should happen. But at the end of the day, there was a common criticism of neoliberalism, and and neoliberalism as defined by government looking at moving away from public goods to private goods in ways that the government works as the active agent and moving toward those models, either empowering developers or using government in ways that allows resources to be consolidated in the hands of the private versus in the hands of the public. And that public is being defined very much in terms of private corporate interests rather than community grassroots interests. And it was interesting to see even students who want to make their way up into the business world, some of them, their parents are developers in Brooklyn, say, I should go challenge my father on this. I said, hey, don't tell him my name. So I think I probably spent my time here, but Professor Martinez, it was a pleasure signing this book, and thank you all for your time. Yeah.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Alan. I love your comments, and thank you for bringing out various things. Now I can focus a little. I am going to stick mostly to the book. I have a few pictures and a few things to show you. But I think what I'd like to concentrate on is elaborating a little more of what you said about some of the concepts in the book and reading a few passages from the book. I guess I should say the Power at the Roots was work that took place that I did as part of my, in the first place as my dissertation research, and then I went back, and that was during the period when Mayor Giuliani was actually trying to sell the gardens. So from 1996 to about 2000, Mayor Giuliani had announced that now that throughout the city, he announced the plans to basically auction off community gardens to developers. And how many people remember that? Yeah. The thing was that gardens had no formal designation. Through the city's Green Thumb program, gardens were still listed on the city's books as vacant lots, even if they'd been there after 20 years and they had water features and plants and trees and memories and entire families who'd grown up running around them. In the city's books, they were vacant lots and there was no legal protection for them. The Green Thumb leases were basically issued with the proviso that the city could take them back at any time. So from 96 to 99, the community gardeners waged what ultimately was an extremely successful battle to force the mayor back. And you may remember during the 98 and 99, a lot of people dressed like sunflowers getting arrested, and that was them. And a lot of people thought that they would go away because they had no legal standing and because they'd all signed papers that said they didn't have the right to their gardens. But they actually forced the city to stop and pause. And looking at it back 10 years on, and I did go back out and do another period of research to follow up on what had happened, that was a period where a lot of gardeners paused and rethought what their gardens did and what they accomplished in their neighborhoods. And I was just last weekend at the food conference in Brooklyn. There was a big conference, over 5,000 people attending on food justice in Brooklyn. And you can see that certainly community gardens, that just in the 10 years since that struggle, that we have become much more articulate and purposeful and protective of those spaces. So I'm very proud that I got a chance to capture what that period meant and to see that now obviously food justice has been going on for a while, but in New York, that period, and a lot of community gardeners will say that period of just almost seeing everything that they had worked and bled for 20 years swept away, really made them think about what they did. So I am from the Lower East Side. I'm a 3rd Street and Avenue C girl. Grew up right across the street from the New Rican Poets Cafe and the public housing project there. And when I was in graduate school, wanted a way to write about my neighborhood and what was happening to it, and found my way to this. And I think I wanted to, with regards to the two concepts that you very usefully brought together about really about Latinidad and sort of the way that local praxis and also taming, I grew up in a political family, and one thing you know from growing up in the Lower East Side is that the notion of community is at once very powerful and very present, but you also grow up understanding that it's very tricky and in some cases it's completely a fiction. The Lower East Side is a contentious neighborhood. There's over a century of labor struggles and all kinds of community struggles there. Lower East Siders just have a, terrible reputation for being troublemakers, which is well earned. And many social experiments emerge from out of that neighborhood. All over the world, I'm proud to say, and many of the most progressive things we have in the country come from Lower East Side and Lower East Side. And Puerto Ricans were a big part of that, and a big part of the struggle to make communities livable in the 1960s and 1970s. But they didn't do it alone. And a lot of what happens in the Lower East Side is about these tricky moments of collaboration, about very conservative Puerto Rican doñas learning to like dreadlocked anarchists and figure out what you have in common, about figuring out when you can work with a snooty gentrifier and go to the community board meeting and stand up together. And there's a constant negotiation of saying, eso de la comunidad. And then you say, well, you were standing with this guy, and they go, oh, he's a fighter. And that, I think, probably that experience, that really tuned me into this concept of community as something that is never made. We talk about community as an accomplished fact, but in fact, it's little moments of unity and assertiveness and solidarity are what community movements actually are. I would argue even in the most, supposedly most unitary communities. And the local praxis that I put my finger on, or that I was trying to put my finger on, is about what you find in gardens, how they relate to that ability to spot those moments when you can work with someone and you can really use that to just really, pardon my language, fuck up the mayor, and that is, and that process of collaboration is something that the gardens teach you. And that's what community gardens, so a lot of my study is about learning to see that and learning to see people, how people work together in the gardens. So I'd like to start with saying something about how people relate to gardens. And just one of my favorite quotes came early on. This is a woman who I interviewed. I talk about two kinds of gardens. There's the casita gardens that are largely controlled by Latinos and especially Puerto Ricans. And then there are what I've called sometimes artist gardeners or formally organized gardeners that are gardens that often went through a process of ethnic transition and became more sort of put together, that became often they've built it, and they're the ones that were often the ones that were seen as really, we're going to save these. They're often very sophisticated. And can talk a little bit about the dialogue between formal casita and formally organized gardens. But a gardener from an artist gardener that I interviewed talked about, she thought a lot about gardening, and she said every single person who does work on a garden is a certain kind of person willing to do something for nothing. And its reward can be the plant being beautiful. It could be that I've made a sculpture here. It can be that I bring my friends here and they see how fabulous I am. The whole ego gratification thing. And that's one of the things when people talk about the garden is very personal, that's what they're talking about. Even when you play music in the garden, it's the same thing. They're playing the music for everyone, but it's for their own ego gratification. So it's about the community and that I'm involved with something that is making the world a better place. And so I think about that concept a lot. There are people like that and they're in that garden. And what it boils down to, we're talking about egos and the essence of your being, all these things. And so what happens is there's a lot invested in the garden. To a person that's not interested in plants, they just don't see plants. But somebody that put their heart into it and put their hands in the ground and paid for it or whatever, that's something that you've invested in. So the starting point is really that gardens are places that started, and this is just I don't have many slides, I'll try and keep them to a minimum, but this is a map from online that gives a kind of, you can see that these were all places throughout the Lower East Side that had basically burned to the ground in the 1970s. And many of them looked like this. This was the start of a garden. And you can imagine, you had people who were homesteading and working in those gardens, and their children are playing on a lot that looks like this. Often they're chasing drug dealers off of that to be able, and that was the start of one garden on 4th Street close to, between Avenue C and D. That's where they started. And imagine the investment. Sorry? This is all on the Lower East Side. This is in the Lower East Side. This is on 3rd Street and Avenue. Yeah, between C and D. And so enormous sacrifices, and people will tell you harrowing stories of facing down drug dealers, of going out with gloves to pick up hypodermic needles so their kids could play without getting stuck by spikes, of, toxic chemicals because developers, contractors would just dump stuff because they didn't want to pay for the city dump space, so they would just illegally dump. And to make gardens was an enormous act of faith and labor. And that's what the city was saying never sort of happened. So you can imagine what it meant to people to confront that. So the start, and if you think about it, and I often ask when I'm teaching at Brooklyn, where I work with Alan, I often ask my students, where are the places in the city where you can do this, where you can take over a piece of land and you can play with it and plant it and make it your own and expect to have some control over it. And one of the big ways that the city feels frustrating, one of the things we're losing is that ability. We have all these places of play. We've got the beautiful riverside parks. We've got all sorts of, refurbished spaces, and it's very nice. But real control, the ability to arrange it to your own space and to give it to the world at large is not something the city is giving us right now. And we need to understand, and gardens are places that are important because they teach us to remember that. So that is the start of praxis. From here, when you start with this, you learn how to work with your neighbors. You learn how to invest in your neighborhood. You get a sense of agency and ownership of where you live. And that you get a grounded knowledge that's literally in your body, at the fingerprints and the plants that you tend. And there's a whole kind of an ecology of memory and place that's built around gardens. And then you get gentrification, and there was a lot of things like this happening on the Lower East Side at the time. I grew up, this is Bracetti houses on the side, so picture me a little kid there, and right next door, these photos, by the way, are by a wonderful local photographer who's kind of the bard of the Lower East Side, Marlise Momber, but she contributed several photos to the book. She's been photographing the struggles of the Lower East Side for over 40 years. And the Centro, by the way, and I forgot to thank the Centro for hosting me, but I will. The Centro has her photos on archive available. And these visions, like the gardens, were some of the things that were around at the time. This was an old synagogue. When the neighborhood was Jewish, this was a religious building, or yeshiva. And eventually it was burned out and abandoned. And in the 70s, when I was a kid, there was a vision, and Marlise was actually part of the effort to make it into a community center. It was going to be a place where they taught wood shop and printing. And there was all kinds of efforts to find funding and make this as part of the effort of having locally community-centered, community-based centers for training and for these things. 10 years later, that dream was gone, and that was kind of the start. And this was in the mid-'80s. This is one of the first buildings that became eventually co-ops. It started out as affordable loft co-ops, and now the sign says luxury loft co-ops. That sort of contraction of space, so the gardens go, the community buildings go. Growing up on the Lower East Side was an experience from the 80s onward of steadily contracting space. There's always a joke that's saying they're going to push us in the river. It starts with Avenue A, B, C, D, and we're all going to end up swimming in the river. So it's kind of the defining experience for growing up for me. In the struggle for gentrification and over the debate over how to save the gardens, one of the ways that the pressures of gentrification came up was in how people talked about the gardens. There was a sense that it wouldn't be possible to save all the gardens, although ultimately nearly every garden that was threatened was saved, which is interesting. And the Lower East Side had a much higher rate of saving them than a lot of other neighborhoods. Harlem lost a lot more. You have these two kinds of gardens, the casita garden and the what I'll call the formally organized garden. One tends to be una yarda, very yard-like. It's mostly controlled often by a circle of families who are established there. You can see the casita in the back. For people to save money, there isn't a lot of money to buy new soil, which is actually, or do abatement, which is actually very expensive. People put down carpeting often so that people can play because there's heavy metals in the soil. There'll be a little kitchen gardening, but often it's a place to sit out, to get, for big families to get out of small apartments and sit outside and enjoy the air and enjoy each other's company. On the other hand, you have formally organized gardens that often take up multiple lots. Casita gardens are often one tenement lot size. And then you have these larger gardens that have people walked around the Lower East Side and seen these gardens? Let me see hands. So you can see some of these are beautifully landscaped. And they often include artistic programming. They often have stages. There'll be water features, wonderful ecological experiments going on in them, and they're beautiful and they're a pleasure to do. One of the things that came up was that, well, a lot of people said, well, we'll save that kind, but this kind is not a good garden. One of the early titles of my draft of the book was The Good Garden, and there was a whole discussion that was very morally laden and very frustrating, especially for Puerto Ricans, about, what was the good garden. And so what I can say now is just to read a little about how I deal with that in the book. And what I argue is that when you look at how the gardens function, in fact, there isn't really a case for one to be necessarily considered as more open or better, mostly in appearance. This one reflects more inputs, but that when you look at how they function, they have different communal frames for who they serve and what they're trying to accomplish. And that wasn't getting into the debate about what a good garden was. And particularly with the casita garden, when I tried to look, people would say people said there were activists who were getting arrested, and people would say, usually white activists would say, I'm not getting arrested so that someone can sit around and drink beer and play dominoes and not let anyone from the community in, because that is public land and it makes all gardens look bad. What they fail to appreciate, I argued, is that there is a communal vision there. This goes to how Latinidad was being perpetuated in these casita gardens. So I said, onlookers perceived correctly that the casita gardens were functioning as a kind of defended space they couldn't access, even though the gardens were sited on city-owned land. That characterization is too simple because it fails to say certain things about both kinds of gardens. In fact, formally organized gardens are in many respects not as open as they appear. To have real control and participation in a formally organized garden, one must become well known by other gardeners and display a sense of commitment. For example, one wouldn't want to give a key to someone who might be prone to throwing open the garden for late night drinking or smoking grass. So most gardens wait to give a new member a key until they are known and judged to be able to use the space responsibly. On the other hand, in a casita garden, closedness is ethnic particularity, but of a kind that is informed by a deep moral commitment to community and ethnic progress. It is a space that is open to the community, but it is not a public community. It is a community of acquaintance and commitment. Casita gardeners see this as a perfectly fair and necessary distinction to make based on the history of struggle that underlies community gardens. One woman described her garden as being for gente de around, people from around, not necessarily all well known to her, but people whom she could identify as having roots in the community. Another woman said angrily that her garden was for people who were there on the Lower East Side during the years of struggle, not for anyone who just arrived. That distinction shows how important history and memory are in helping people to make sense of who belongs and who is worthy in a neighborhood. For longtime residents, especially those who lived through the 70s and 80s, who struggled is a fair question to use to decide who should have priority in enjoying the amenities of the new Lower East Side. Part of enjoying being together and part of affirming the sense of a Puerto Rican community is the sense of a kind of non-specific, organic deliberation process that happens sitting around food. So it's not about having the meeting, it's about you're deliberately it's part of the pleasure of it is not needing to bregar with all that. It's feeling that you are working together to share food and enjoy the company with each other. And that actually, and because gentrifiers could show the Green Thumb Charter and say you need to have the rules, that actually was part of the way that Puerto Ricans often lost control of their gardens. You start to have the meetings and it stops being the place that it meant to them. And they often sort of just take a card table and play dominoes on the sidewalk because they can't do it anymore. I'll just say a little bit about this idea about bridging politics that Arlene mentioned and what, some of the sort of conclusions that I draw from looking at the gardens. Gardens are not ideal space, and throughout this book there is a lot of petty fighting. If you actually know many gardeners, you know that they're often difficult people. You know, gardening is about control, and when you have to share a small space among many people, there's going to be arguments. So a lot of gardening life is just blow-ups about daylilies and sage and everything. But people come with an idea that it should be ideal. There's something about the semiotic meaning of the garden as an idealized place, as a paradise on earth, and about trying to create that puts people on their good behavior. So so gardens were an interesting place to study gentrification because you could assume good intentions. And that's interesting, and that's not something you can usually assume in a gentrifying neighborhood that's sharply polarized. But in a garden, you could look at those interactions with people starting being well-meaning and still really pissing each other off. I would say that they generate praxis and they make people behave better because they come with this expectation for good behavior and for some kind of commitment to building something bigger than yourself. Also, we all know how adept in gentrified neighborhoods people can be at just not being around each other. About, leaving the cafe you go to when the hipsters go in, because it's gone now. But when you go to a garden, the likelihood increases that you are going to meet a broader range of people. And that serves a bridging function. I also talk about how gardeners amongst themselves, the ethic of gardening encourages what I call individual rather than categorical interaction. You can't deal in a garden. You get told off in a garden if you try to deal with someone as a troublesome Puerto Rican or a pain in the ass gentrifier. You have to deal with people from their intentions and what they do in the garden, the kind of work that they do and what they accomplish, and that is a place that's something that doesn't happen a lot in gentrifying neighborhoods. And then just because even though Puerto Ricans and long-timers have a deeper connection with the neighborhood, that doesn't foreclose that people coming after don't acquire a different neighborhood, learn something new through their activity, and that is something like praxis. So to think of praxis as something that is renewable by having spaces of encounter is important. And so you learn, over debates about, the Tupperware and the food or daylilies or whatever, how to relate to your neighborhood in new ways. And to return to my initial idea, that's where the skill keeps going, to find ways to reach out, to find unity, and to find your way to assertions of community. You don't get from these spaces an idealized, perfect, organic community of the kind we all dream of having, but you get people who can reach out and make those connections and think about them strategically and who care enough to make those risks. So I think that they continue to be really important for that reason. And in this time of looking at all food security and food systems, I think what I've tried to do is think about these social contributions that they make as also deeply important. So I want to just stop. I'm very bad. I tend to launch into things. I do this to my students too. I launch into my lecture. But I want to thank all you people for being here. Thank you so much. And for your attention. We'll take questions in a moment. I want to thank the Centro for coordinating this. Evelyn for coordinating everything. And Arlene and Alan for their comments. So thank you very much.
Within these housing projects, you have NORCs, natural occurring residential communities where they've aged in place. And many of the older residents there usually have some sort of home care system. Was there any use of these gardens in terms of some of these older individuals who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's as part of the non-pharmacological mode of treatment, or as a way to keep them engaged so that one can deal with some of the behavioral changes and the mood changes that occur?
In general, various gardens, you'll find that they often, gardens continue to be, they're now incorporated under land trusts. And gardens, many gardens participate and do hosting arrangements with all kinds of groups who bring youth, criminals or former exiting prisoners, and also elderly. So I'm sure if you look, you will find something like that, and that you will find people using the gardens for that reason. The question of gardens in the housing projects is an interesting one. The city has been there's a lot of open land and if you go through the projects on Avenue D, you will often see that there are gardens there that are set aside. And the city, the NYCHA actually has been somewhat responsive to expanding gardening. But they're also selling off, they have an enormous deficit and they're also selling off acres. So it's an interesting idea. I don't know how widespread you would find it, but I know in terms of formalized programs, but many gardeners, actually, now that I think about it, many people in the greening movement in New York, in Green Thumb, talk about the fact that gardening population in general is aging. They're having a little trouble pulling in younger kids. So I'm sure you will find that, and I think it's true that in terms of contact with nature, you know, the ability to interact with nature has immense therapeutic value. But you're quite right about that.
Is this concept of control over this public space, and a type of control that is privatizing at times, right? And I think that you captured it very nicely in the distinction between casita versus formally organized gardens per se. And if anything, perhaps to tackle that question of control of publicly owned property, if you could talk about perhaps about the world visions that the people who came up with the casita and what was it that they expected to do with the casita, and the people who come in from the outside, whether they are homesteaders, whether they are hipsters, whether they are yuppies, who have their own visions, romantic or not, about the community that they envision for the future. Perhaps we can understand a little bit about who gains control of these public spaces.
And that's not only a question about, you know, ethnic transition to gentrification. That's also about, I'm looking for a quote in particular. That's also about where the gardens have ended up in the new era we're in the aftermath of the assault on the gardens in the 1990s. One of the things that happened was that the city didn't just let the gardens go. What happened was that the city agreed to sell the gardens to a land trust, and that the gardens would basically become more formalized. Is it better if I stand up? Basically become more formalized, and there's now a sort of evolving, but first they were passed over to a group of foundations, Trust for Public Lands, Bette Midler's organization, and then they were organized into land trusts. Just recently, in the last few years, they started to create actually local boards of real local control. But a lot of the control over the gardens devolved sort of upward to the nonprofit sector and became more formalized. And there are still catches and there are still clauses in the gardens. Bloomberg insisted that there still be gardens, that there still be means for repossessing gardens if they became defunct, if they were non-performing. So if there is a garden on a really nice patch of land and a developer wants it enough, he can go in and figure out how to do it. And gardeners are very sensitive to that. So gardens today, so now I argue, like, in view of the sort of greater sense of sophistication about what gardens can do, the greater sense of ambition and the programmatic oversight has things to contribute from that point of view. It makes gardens more purposeful, but it has to mean that gardens become less free, and that they become less, as they become more linked into sponsored initiatives and programs, the space for that kind of crazy invention that used to be there, of just sort of making them your own spaces is diminished. And there's really fascinating, you can see the neoliberalization of the gardens. You can see when you go around that there's sponsorships by Scott. there's signs. And I was trying to find a quote, I didn't find it, but there was, I don't know if anyone has passed a garden called Generation X. It's on 4th Street between B and C. And it's run by a guy named Edwin Santana, who made his own logo that he got tattooed on his belly of a Taino woman standing on the globe and holding a conch shell. And he's got a zillion, and he's got like, he's got all the flags of the world, and he holds aretos. He holds outdoor, you know, they're sort of traditional Puerto Rican outdoor celebrations with music and performing. People come over from the New Rican because it's right across the street and perform. And I was interviewing Santana in my follow-up interview, and he was talking about the garden, and you know, and he goes, I don't know what I'm gonna do with the money from Disney. And I was like, the mouse Disney? And he said, yeah, we got money, and some people helped me write grants, and I gotta do some soundproofing because the neighbors always complain when we have aretos. And sure enough, this insane, delirious garden got a visit from Wilbur Valderrama, and was on whatever show on Disney Channel Valderrama hosts, and you know, he had a sort of sponsorship of that. And it was a really strange collision. And that is, there has been, unavoidably, the neoliberalization, to some degree, of the gardens. Now, I would argue that on a very level, the experience of gardening and being in a garden is just organic enough and deep enough that the brand names aren't going to get rid of that connection that people establish there. But it's a constriction of space. And the sense that certainly when Puerto Ricans first set out and were doing, you know, in that picture that I had, of these really immensely courageous acts of reclamation and of trying to make a public, you know, order. And if I have interviews with the doñas, with people talking about how, you know, if you wandered into some of those gardens, they would start talking to you about your history. They would start to talk about Puerto Rico. They would show you how to plant. And so it was just as open in the other place, but what they were trying to do was sort of rescue Puerto Ricanness. And that sense, by virtue of having to be public, by having to be targeted to a broader public, that kind of sort of communal link is undermined in some sense. So it's much harder today.
I just have a simple question. I'm just sort of wondering if there is any cross-fertilization between environmental social movements and the establishment of these gardens. Just wondering.
Some of the first gardens, you could say that some of the local gardening movement that happened actually started on the Lower East Side. The Green Guerrillas were started on the Lower East Side. They started with the seed bombs. They would throw water balloons filled with wildflower seeds into empty lots to make them bloom. And so, yeah, people are very cognizant of that. And throughout New York, there's many more kinds of connections being made to environment social movements. And on the Lower East Side, it's interesting, it's harder for the Lower East Side to keep up with some of these innovations. Lower East Side is never going to be a place that can do very much in terms of farming, for example. So you have the urban farms of Red Hook, or the ones that are in East New York, and they just have more space to play and kind of, you know, and generate new ideas about local food systems. The Lower East Siders just have less space you're not gonna do cropping on a tenement lot. Many of the people who participated in many of the gardens went down during the Vieques struggle, for example, and were very active in that. In the 1970s, the Lower East Side had a windmill. So there was all kinds of efforts towards community power and like generation of power. And it bleeds through in other ways. She died this year, but there was a woman named Mary Spink who was a housing activist who ran one of the mutual housing associations. She built a beautiful low income housing project on 3rd Street, the same block as the New Rican Poets, 3rd Street between B and C. It is the only, I think as of now, it is the only building in the state that is for truly low-income people, not mixed income or moderate income. It's 100% low income, and it has a green roof. And she sweat blood to put together the tax subsidies, and basically the way she managed to make that 100% low income was by insisting that the state give her the funding, and finding the funding to find every single energy economy that you could. Every piece of green savings you could push out of that, and she put it all towards making low rents. I believe it's one of the only buildings to date in the state that does that. So there is cross-fertilization. I think that there's not enough cross-fertilization in some sense, but yeah.
Thank you.
First, congratulations on the book. I had a little bit of misgivings when I was invited, and I'm really glad I came. One, for me, I was raised in the Lower East Side. I was born here in '54. I'm gonna be 63 this summer. And a lot of the things you were relating, I lived through in the '70s.
Yeah.
It's just a couple of points about the people who did the community farming gardens in the '60s and '70s. A lot of those people, when I was a teen, were the same people, like Tito and Awilda on 4th Street, had their place, they had a garden next to it. Whoever had a backyard was growing stuff. And those are the same people when I was involved by the elders in the struggle to bring the first Puerto Rican superintendent in the country, Luis Fuentes, in the '70s. Those were the same people that I saw at Woolworths with my mother and my grandmother buying seeds, some of which we took down to the East River Drive Park, not just used, and some were used in the spring and summer in the fire escape gardens.
Yeah.
Which the fire department was always on our back, because if there was a fire, that was a hazard. But you saw that every Puerto Rican family on their floor had a mad amount of pots with all kinds of stuff. And when people came from Puerto Rico, they made sure they brought plants, they brought seeds. But the other thing I remember, and my mother and my grandmother raised pigeons on the roof of the building we
Yes.
lived on 5th Street, and then on 6th Street, and then on 9th Street, because we were constantly moving every time we found a place a little bit better than the one, but always in the Lower East Side, is that we also had plants growing up there, which we would have to help bring in, because in the winter, being people from the Caribbean, we knew better than to leave those plants either on the roof or the fire escape as soon as it started to get a little chilly. So for me, I really appreciate the work you've done. I want to get the book from Magdalena, who's the caretaker, the main caretaker here in El Barrio, or there in El Barrio. There's a community garden, part of the Bette Midler,
Right.
on 110th between 3rd and Lex. And we have had many events, including hosting Ismael Guadalupe. And it's a whole other thing when you have it in a garden, when you have un conversatorio, just a conversation with somebody about an issue, and people are in this garden space, you know. Anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on and on.
It's very funny that, you know, there's this idea of sort of Puerto Ricans or New Yorkers as, you know, the ultimate urban, you know, but the connection to nature and the need for nature is something that really drove what that movement was about. So, yeah.
In my own comments, I made mention of the fact that there are really culturally specific practices, and the examples that you gave are particularly compelling here. And that the gardens themselves, there's motifs embedded in the gardens that reveal a Puerto Rican aesthetic and sensibility. If you could talk a little bit about some of those.
There's actually a lot written on this. I'm certainly not the only one who mentioned this. Luisa Ponte Pares has written about this, and there's actually, I think about 10, 12 years ago, the Smithsonian had a whole exhibit on the aesthetic of the casita. But yeah, the ways that, the interesting thing about the gardens was seeing how people put a social vision, you know, really carved who they are, the community that they belong to in the landscape. So if you go into a casita garden, you'll find the casita, which is something that very deliberately quotes the vernacular architecture in Puerto Rico, the little one-room shack. It's often, and it helps to extend the season on the garden. So you've got that, and it's often painted brightly. You've got certain plants, and like you said, certain plants that need to go in culantro. For years now you can get culantro, but right, it's a sort of, I think it's sort of something that tastes like lemongrass. It's what makes Puerto Rican food taste like Puerto Rican food, and now you can get it. But you used to, I don't know if you remember, you could not, like you couldn't get it for love or money for the longest time. And so you had to grow it, and it was very delicate, and it could die. So you have things like that, oregano, basil, those things that are growing in the garden that were fresh, tomatoes, peppers. You had often the shrine to the Virgin Mary. Sometimes that becomes contentious. If it's public land, you're not supposed to be, making sacred figures. So that was one of the things that people would kind of struggle over a bit sometimes. In some places, they kept having a procession every year, but yeah, the what other examples do I have? I'm actually yeah, those, I think those are good ones. In Edwin Santana's garden, he's got all the flags of the world, but he's also got like these carvings and posts of he's got one post of the ancestors, a Spaniard, an Indian, an African, and to represent the mestizo heritage. So there's all kinds of ways that people they're carving a communal vision in there.
Homesteading. We have a lot of friends that, work for years and years and years, and finally they have all these huge places, the schools across from the park. I had all these community centers. So the Lower East Side, I think, had a lot of struggles that created some kind of communal thing, and I think the gardens, I suppose, were part of that. So if you can talk a little bit, because I've always been very curious about the homesteading, that it was very strong, I think, in the 70s and the 80s, and how all these centers became communities. The Vélez Center in across the park, and it had Celeste Soto Vélez Center, and all these places that all these huge schools that became,
Yeah, I think it's good to point out, and at this point I can use some of the photographs of Marlise Mumber. I hope that's okay, but I'll put them up for a moment just so you can see. There was incredible cross-fertilization, and a lot of the people who participated in those movements participated in multiple movements. And so, and gardens were often, this is a picture that Marlise Mumber was a homesteader. And so homesteading was a way where you had abandoned buildings, people organized to renovate the buildings for affordable housing. And there was a program created of using sweat equity. That is, people would work on their buildings, often on weekends, for years at a time, and you would keep track of your hours, and that would be used to defray the cost of the apartment. And so, and many of the housing that is left on the Lower East Side that is not, that's outside of public housing and that is affordable, many of those began as homesteads. So even though they've kind of risen in price and there are controversies about that, they are a way basically that Lower East Siders, mostly Puerto Ricans, mostly Latinos and African Americans working together, effectively decommodified a very large section of the Lower East Side stock to make it available for people. So this is an example of homesteaders saying a prayer before they go in to do their weekend work. And you can see that it was, people, cross race, generation, gender, would go in and renovate their houses. Homesteaders became gardeners. There was often there was a sense that you're renovating a building and you're reclaiming the building, and next door there is active drug trade. So can you move into the building and can you feel like you have a home if there is really serious open air drug markets happening next to you? So homesteaders often would say, okay, that would be part of what they did actually, that they would work on the house, and then on top of everything else, and these are also people holding full-time jobs, they would go next door, and you would have to start, it was very delicate. You'd put out like a couple of plants, and you'd sort of put out your domino table and the drug dealers wouldn't come that day. Also, artists and performers are critically important. This is one of Marlise's most wonderful pictures. It's not in my book, but it's in many of the collections that she's done. And it sort of shows that the Lower East Side is a bohemian neighborhood, as an artistic neighborhood. The New Rican arts movements, that comes for a reason. And those people were, many of the places of gardens, they were places of declamation, of enjoying each other. And I think that's a good point to make, because right now I tend to think one of the problems over bridging and the kind of imagination that we have about social movements is that as movements become more professionalized and purposeful and programmatic, we lose the sense of cross-fertilization and understanding that all these things are deeply organically connected.
Given the hyper-gentrification in the Lower East Side, what's the balance now between the casitas and the other gardens, and what's the future of the casita version of the garden, considering that the Boricuas are dwindling?
I have some quotes, and I had some interviews with some of the people who were active in the land trust movement. And basically, the conclusion that I come up with is for right now, the crisis has abated. There still are casita gardens, and the agreement, even the agreement to create the land trust, actually took a lot of pressure off of them. Many people, there's been, for the most part, periods of relative peace. But there is a sense, there is this knowledge that if it really gins up again, then those gardens are more vulnerable. Right now, there's kind of a carrot and stick approach. But there's ongoing efforts to kind of force gardeners to upgrade what they accomplish and upgrade for example, when I was doing my return field work, there was a bit of a controversy because the Parks Department, which also controls some gardens, had mandated that gardeners had to increase their open hours and that they had to keep the gates open more often. So basically that's free time that you have to keep the gates open, and because people often have thousands of dollars of their own money and affections, someone has to be on site. So the city kind of unilaterally mandated extended open hours and was telling people they couldn't close the gates. In neighborhoods where you have violence, or if you're a woman gardening alone, for example, in the evening, you want to be able to lock the gate, right? So it's a sense of control in the sense that, no, it's a public place. If you want to be a park, you have to keep it open and you have to use it. So, and gardeners are kind of going back and forth. So, but one of the things that was interesting is that one of the parks people I spoke to basically admitted that those kinds of regulations were a way of kind of forcing gardeners' hands, of forcing them to if you want to do open hours, you would have to recruit new members. If you're a little old lady with a domino table and you're told that you have to do that, you'd have to start thinking about membership. So there's this kind of subtle coercive pressure that's out there. And there's a sense, what someone said was, and right now there's actually quite a lot of outreach to all kinds of gardens. And they do try and reach out to the casita gardens, to the doñas, to make sure that they're doing more. But there's also a sense that, but it's hard for those people to do that. It's expensive, it's stressful, it's not what they understand gardens to be, in some sense, and it's not what they have, how they envision this space. And so if there's ever a new struggle over those gardens, then the casita gardens, to the degree that they don't, and it's not always true that casita gardens are just like sitting around drinking beer. Like there are very good casita gardens that have a lot of people involved in them, but the idea of it being a sort of unprogrammed or informal space is very much still embattled. And right now it's the carrot, but if gentrification pressures resume in certain areas, it'll be the stick. And those gardens remain in the new discourse of, being a sort of functioning community organization. Those gardens are more vulnerable. They're trying to provide help to do that, but that still means changing in pretty radical ways.
As we see this move toward corporate sponsorship of gardens, has the structure and the form of the gardens changed in both the casitas and the other types of gardens you've seen to more sanitized, controlled spaces where people in the environment are regulated? And have you seen aesthetics change in terms of what we see as beautiful and what is acceptable?
That has gone through some different changes. I'm not sure where that's going to end up. In the first wave, there was a whole thing about making the garden appear more landscaped. And I talk about that a lot in my book. There was pitched battles because a lot of the gardens used to have individual plots. So you would have these 10 by 10 plots where one person is growing tomatoes and one person's growing roses and whatever, so it was very patchy looking. And this New York, you probably don't perceive this, has this kind of old white shoe establishment around gardening and open space. The Central Park Conservancy, the Bronx Botanic Garden, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, you know, they come from a kind of Anglo-based, they have their own cultural perspective. Anglo, the Olmsted, the landscaped English gardening tradition. So in many of the gardens, there were pitched battles over landscaping. That means people foregoing food-based plots so that you put in and making more unified gardens. So that picture that I showed you of the garden, of the formally organized garden on the right, that is one where there would have been what's sort of not in that picture necessarily is, you know, the fights with the little old ladies who had the tomato plants who were told that no, we're gonna have to put this together to make those paths and everything. Now though, it's interesting, you've had a kind of paradigm shift with the sustainability movement. So telling people that they can't have food crops is no longer okay. And so it's kind of interesting to see what will come of that. One of the things happens that if you do food production, though, you now, food production is tricky. Certainly if you're doing food for sale, it's very, very, someone was explaining to me, if you're growing lettuce, for example, or you're growing certain things, you have to, and you're an urban farm, you have to watch out for cats. Because you can't let cat urine or cat feces, which can be contaminated with toxoplasmosis, into the soil. So all of a sudden, you gotta figure out how to get the cats out before you can think about really eating or sharing that food more widely. It sort of creates a whole new level. So there's some things in a transition about that. But in general, there was a forced shift to a more landscape thing that made it harder. It definitely made it harder for certain things to be expressed. There was an ongoing thing over the roosters and the hens, and you know, people used to keep chickens. And the city, there was like a chicken squad. They were hunting down casita gardeners and just extra, you were not supposed to have a chicken. Now there's heirloom chicken breeding in Greenpoint, you know, so we're at a kind of a crossroads with that.
I think it was a great question on the over-privatization of what should be more sort of publicly accessible goods, whether they're gardens. Has anybody read about, in parallel here, anybody read about the bike share program being implemented?
Yeah.
City, is it called City Bike or City Share? After Citibank, obviously.
Citibank, yeah.
Did anybody see how much it costs for a day? I believe I read $40.
I heard
Now-
85 a year.
Oh, 85 a year. Oh, no. I read, but if you use your card, you get. If you use it for a day, I read.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, something like $40. Now, if I go to other cities where it isn't sponsored, it's more of a public-private partnership, or isn't sponsored solely by a corporation, you can rent them for $3-4 an hour. Now, who has $40? I mean, totally. I mean, to rent them for a day. So I find this sort of movement very, very, very problematic in the way we're sort of moving towards sort of more greening initiatives. But it comes out to the question is who's in power of those greening initiatives and who's making the decisions? Is the community involved? You know, and to what extent do they match the level of power as corporate interests? So that's something that it's going to come down the line as part of the anti-neoliberal movement.
I want to thank you all for coming. There are several copies available here for purchase. And if you can't do that, I want to really encourage you to go to the university library or to your local library and read the book, because it is a powerful testament to what a community of gardeners do, and it's a history that really shouldn't be forgotten. So, thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.